Well, a major shock is an event or a series of related events which make a big difference to how a large number of states behave. So clearly World War II, the end of World War II, was a big shock, and we're still living in the world today with the system that was created as a result of World War II. The world would have been very different if Germany and Japan had won that war rather than the Allied powers, including the Soviet Union. Since then, I think the biggest shock was the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War was one of the main defining features of international relations for almost half a century. And then suddenly it ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, and we're now living still in a post-end of the Cold War era. But perhaps the other big shock of this period since 1990 was the 9/11 attack by Al-Qaeda on the United States, which set in chain a whole series of events which would not have happened without that. Without the 9/11 attack, there would not have been an American attack in Afghanistan. There would probably not have been an American attack on Iraq. So the Middle East would look very different. There have been a number of, I would suggest, rather smaller but significant shocks as well. The Arab uprisings in 2011 onwards were a significant shock, and it's the nature of international relations that you can't predict shocks, or at least you can predict many shocks, but you don't know which ones will actually occur. But they do make a difference. As scholars of international relations, we like to deal in structural factors, long-term trends and relationships, but those structural predictions, explanations are often thrown off course by something big and important that happens which we were not predicting. Brexit could be a major shock, but of course it's too early to tell because the UK has not yet left the European Union. It is still a full member of the European Union, and it has yet to agree terms on which it will leave the European Union. So a lot depends on what that future relationship is. If it's a hard Brexit, if the UK leaves the European Union on bad terms with a bad relationship, then it will be more of a shock and more difficult to adapt to. I think the consequences of Brexit also depend on whether the European Union that remains has further shocks or further defections. If another major country were to leave the European Union, or if the euro currency were to come under much greater strain, then potentially the whole European Union project would be under threat. Right now, that doesn't seem likely, but it is possible. If you had a radical government in Italy, for example, elected next year, and Italy decided it was no longer prepared to be part of the euro, then that would be very difficult for France and Germany and the countries still in the euro to maintain stability. The European Union is a unique construct. The European security system as a whole, the European Union and NATO together, a very unique construct created in the aftermath of World War II and the determination of European democratic states never to go to war again. And they created this structure which it saved the nation state at a time when nationalism was bankrupt in Europe as a result of the catastrophe of the war, by ensuring that those nations constrained their sovereignty in NATO and the European Union. Countries are in the European Union, NATO, partly because they're determined to, yes, sometimes they disagree on issues, but determined to resolve those disagreements in a peaceful and institutional way. I think in recent years, partly because of economic factors, we've seen a rise of nationalism in Europe, in a number of European countries, which wants to take back power to the nation state and is more suspicious of globalization and that's a real threat to the European Union. The election of Emmanuel Macron in France, however, is giving another chance for the supporters of European integration, and we shall see in the next 5 years whether Macron is able to turn around the situation in France, which that will be absolutely critical as to whether the European Union project survives. Well, one of the interesting things I think about the argument within the European Union between nationalists and internationalists, between those who support European integration and those who want to take power back to the state, is that not in the UK but in other European Union countries, the more nationalist forces tend also to be more sympathetic to Russia, because Russia has a concept of international order in Europe which is much more about the independence of nation states and the importance of great powers. I think what Russia would like in Europe is a return to the 19th century, where the main decisions about how Europe is governed are made by a group of 4 or 5 countries, of which Russia would be one. Russia, Germany, Britain, France, maybe the United States, maybe not, who would agree what would happen in Ukraine or Poland or Bosnia. And the European concept of that is very different. It's a concept based on clear rules. It's a concept based on the rights of small states as well as large states. It's a concept based on the unacceptability of changing borders by force. And in order to explain why European states were so concerned by Russia's annexation of Crimea, and indeed so concerned by what China is trying to do in the South China Sea, is not because of the inherent value of Crimea in economic terms, or even actually in strategic terms. There was already a Russian base in Crimea long before these events. It's because it's seen as breaking a rule about not changing borders by force, which is part of the rules-based order which Europeans have created after World War II. The European Union was designed to contain nationalism, contain German nationalism most of all at first, but also contain other nationalisms which are becoming more important in this period. But I think most European Union countries still accept that these rules are really important. And facing Russia, I think the fact that Russia is adopting a more nationalist policy based on protection of its own national interests and not being prepared to abide by international rules and international law is making the European Union and NATO more united than it has been for some time, because they see a common threat. Some of the countries in Eastern Europe perhaps a bit more nationalist, Poland and Hungary in particular, but Poland at least also very concerned with Russia. And part of the deal, I think, with the rest of Europe is that there has to be a convergence of political approach if that security alliance between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is to be sustained. There's an interesting contrast here between Russia and China. Russia is a country in many respects which is racing against the clock. In structural terms, it's a power in significant relative decline, particularly compared with China. 20 years ago, Russia, both in terms of national income and even more so in military strength, was much more powerful than China. In the Cold War, of course, the Soviet Union was the world's second power with a global influence and a number of satellite states in Eastern Europe and some elsewhere in the world. And China was a large population, yes, but a very poor country with very limited capability for projecting military power. Today, however, the tables have been turned and Russia, of course, lost its empire and lost much of the former Soviet Union, but it's also an economy which is stagnating. It's not growing very rapidly, even before sanctions. very dependent on oil and gas exports, the price for which has fallen, and with a falling population which would have fallen even more rapidly without immigration from Central Asia. While China, on the other hand, is a country which still believes that time is on its side. It's still growing rapidly. In 5 or 10 years' time, it still believes it will be bigger than it is now. It's able to invest in a growing military capability without straining its economy. China is not increasing the proportion of its national income it's spending on defense, but by maintaining it, it's able to grow its military spending by 7 or 8% a year in real terms, and with that it's buying more sophisticated weapons and capabilities, naval capabilities, to accompany its growing global economic role. So China really is becoming a second superpower, very different in nature from the United States, but it's still very considerable indeed. And I think in terms of global security, the relationship with China is more important than the relationship with Russia, which is, I think, in the end, primarily a question of European security. Will China be a stabilizing factor over this period? I think a lot depends on whether China is able to be a country which bases its action on abiding by the rules of the international system, and that doesn't mean that it will only be existing rules. I think China has such a weight that it has a right and an expectation that it will be involved in the evolution of those rules, the setting of those rules in relation to economy, for example, in relation to dispute resolution, in relation to combating climate change or other new technological developments, the rise of the robotics, the genomics revolution. There are lots of areas where you can't achieve progress globally unless China is involved and Europe is involved and America is involved. There are some powers which have to be at the table to make meaningful progress in tackling global issues. Now, it's possible that China will decide that it wants to go down a competitive path, that it will want to focus its energies on becoming the dominant power in East Asia and excluding the United States from that region, and do that in a way which is confrontational rather than collaborative. It's possible the United States will not be prepared to give China the increased power that I think goes along with increased resources. But I think it's possible. I think even now, I think it's a bit more likely that China, with some complications along the way, some confrontation along the way, will be prepared to bargain in return for more say in setting global rules. It's already on the Security Council and playing a more active role there perhaps than it has in the past, playing a more active role in UN peacekeeping. Interesting example of this is when the new American administration under Donald Trump said that it no longer believed in the need to combat climate change, the reaction from China was not, as it would have been 20 years ago, if the Americans are not doing it, how can you expect a poor country to help? The Chinese reaction was to say, no, we are going to continue to lead in this issue because we think it's important. And that gained China a lot of credit in Europe, in Canada, in a number of other countries which thought this issue was very important. So if the Donald Trump phenomenon continues, who knows? But if we have a continuation of this phenomenon, it will weaken American power and potentially increase Chinese power if they're prepared to act as a responsible power, they're prepared to make friends rather than enemies, then time will be in China's side. But if China, on the other hand, takes a route of confrontation, for example, in the South China Sea, seeks to use military force against its neighbors, then the situation will be very different indeed, because the military balance in East Asia is still one which in the end favors the United States, and the prospect of a major war between US and China, perhaps not very high, but it is there. And these historically moments when leadership in the international system passes from one power to another can be moments where the possibility of war increases as the existing dominant power of the United States could be reluctant to give away very much, and the Chinese should expect more than is realistic. So it will be a hard transition period. think there are real challenges in terms of non-proliferation globally. We have right now 9 states that have nuclear weapons. Iran's program has for now been frozen, but if that were to be lifted, they could become a 10th. But for now, that's, I think, under a significant degree of control. There are massive problems in relation to North Korea. And there's, I think, a continuing potential for conflict, even nuclear conflict, between India and Pakistan. So those are the 2 areas, India, Pakistan and North Korea, which I would have the biggest worry about in the next years. A big terrorist attack in India, for example, supported from people in Pakistan, could trigger a conflict. Who knows how that would develop. North Korea is seeking to acquire long-range missiles which would be able to attack the United States itself, the continental United States, with long-range missiles. And it's hard to imagine an American government that would be prepared for North Korea to get that possibility, to get that capability. But on the other hand, they're running out of options for doing so. Sanctions are not working. They're not stopping the North Korean program. And military action against North Korea is still very hard to imagine that being taken without triggering another Korean war. There are no easy military options in relation to North Korea of the sort that were tried in Iraq and Syria in the past. So no easy choices. And I think you can't rule out the possibility that if a war in the Korean Peninsula was started, then North Korea would use nuclear weapons against its neighbours as part of a desperate effort by the regime to survive. The other, I think, important point to make is that most of the countries of the world actually have signed up to a proposal for a nuclear ban treaty that would ban nuclear weapons worldwide. The problem is that the process through which they're seeking to achieve that objective is getting countries one by one to sign up to this treaty. And the only countries that look likely to sign up to the nuclear ban treaty are countries which don't have nuclear weapons already. Whereas, in my view, if you want to achieve nuclear disarmament, you have to start with negotiations between the countries that do have those weapons. More than 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world are possessed by 2 countries, by the United States and Russia. And therefore, if you want to make real progress in nuclear disarmament, you have to start with negotiations between those 2. But the relations between the US and Russia are perhaps as bad as they have ever been. They're more complicated now because nobody really knows what the US president wants. And very striking the way in which he said very little about Russia in his meeting with other NATO leaders in Brussels recently. So there's a lot of uncertainty about where Donald Trump's going. But certainly when I was in Moscow recently talking to Russian experts, not much expectation that Donald Trump will actually deliver an improvement in relations. More concerned that his unpredictability could itself be a source of problems and crisis. If there's a new issue in relation to Russia, who knows what Trump could do. His bombing in Syria, for example, against a Syrian airbase which had, we understand, Russian personnel involved, was taking real risks in relation to conflict with Russia. So the Russians are not at all comfortable with where Donald Trump is going. As a result, on the nuclear issue, the nuclear file, I don't anticipate much progress in the near future.